Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. I'd like to welcome our online audiences and our live stream audiences, and also those who will come later on watching our videos either on YouTube or Facebook. This is one of over 600 programs we've done since the pandemic began. And it's a fascinating story that Rebecca has unearthed about her great-great aunt, Mildred Harnack, who was a grad student in Berlin in the early 30s, 1930s that was, and in Berlin, and ended up in the resistance against Hitler. Fascinating story. Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us at the Commonwealth Club to share your story.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think before we get to Mildred, let's come right up to the current time. You investigated this story about your relative. You found out not only, I mean, she's known, people have known about her. Her whole story hasn't been that well, but she wasn't erased from history. But your family wasn't overwhelmingly interested in having her story, be part of the family lore. So you had to pass through those barriers. Does anybody in the family think that you went too far by bringing all the information out or not?
No. And the members of my family who felt this way was limited to just one, who was my great grandmother, Harriet, who was Mildred's eldest sister. And she did urge the family to burn all of Mildred's letters and photographs after Mildred was executed.
There was a personal reason for that. Her own daughter got involved. So why don't you say a little bit about Jane too?
Sure, yes, Jane, my grandmother. Jane was 21 when she decided to go to Berlin and to live with Mildred, whom she idolized. And so while she was there, she fell in love with a German man who actually was secretly involved in the resistance as well, although she did not know it. And they got married. And then she got caught up in Germany during the Second World War. So her mother, Harriet, was tremendously, let's just say she wasn't happy about the situation.
Right.
So that was one of the reasons that she was deeply resentful of Mildred for enticing her daughter to Berlin. And another reason I think that my great-grandmother was upset, this was the way that she dealt with her grief. It was tremendously traumatic to learn that her youngest sister was beheaded on Hitler's direct order.
Your parent, who is the child of Jane, father or mother?
Oh, father, yes, my father.
Mm-hmm. And was he alive at the time? Because I know Jane had to escape with children, right? So was he alive?
He had to escape with children, and he was alive, yes. He was about 3.
Does he remember this at all?
Oh, yes, he does. He has several vivid memories of that time, but he never met Mildred. By this point, they had been separated, and she was beheaded in 1943.
Right. All right. So that's the background, family background, and everything. First of all, fascinating insight into two things. One particular woman's journey in this time, but also what it was like to be right in the middle of the Nazis' beginning and growth and their influence and how they changed things. And there have been things, of course, written on it, but this was a great personal story that gives you an insight on what it's like to be in a situation where an organization, the government, is ratcheting it up every 6 months. And I thought you captured that really wonderfully. So why don't we talk a little bit about how Mildred found herself in Berlin?
Yes. So Mildred was born and raised in Milwaukee. She had a rather impoverished childhood. Her father was a frequently unemployed insurance salesman / a store clerk slash butcher slash horse trader. So you get the idea. Her mother was a suffragette, a self-taught stenographer, and supported the family when the father went off for weeks at a time and disappeared. And so Mildred grew up from, moving from one boarding house to another every time their father could not pay the rent.
So what year she was, sorry, but she was born, it almost sounds like a 30s story, but she was born in like 1905 or
1902.
1902.
Yes.
So her father doing all this was in the 19-aughts, so to speak, and
yes.
Yeah, okay.
And then he did die alone in a barn, and so Mildred, then her mother moved her to Chevy Chase, Maryland, where she basically lived for the next year while she attended school in Washington D.C. in Georgetown, and it was a very different kind of experience for her. The children of senators and diplomats went there, and she declared her desire to go to college. Neither of her parents had attended college, so in 1919. She made this declaration, and so she attended. She went to the University of Berlin. Pardon me, that was later. She went to the University of Wisconsin, and she received her BA in humanities. And while she was there, she was radicalized. She joined a student group called the Friday Nighters, which was a sort of fizzy mix of self-proclaimed socialists and anti-fascists and communists. And it was there that she met Arvid Harnack, who was a German, who was also, at this point that she was pursuing her master's degree, I should mention. So after her BA, she enrolled in a master's program. And she met Arvid Harnack. He shared her concern and passion for women's rights and for workers' rights. They were both very much influenced by the progressive movement in Wisconsin. And a week after she received her master's degree, they married. And then in 1929, after teaching for a year at Goucher College in Baltimore, she joined Arvid in Germany and enrolled in a PhD program. And so it was her intention to get her PhD. He was also working on his PhD. And they envisioned a quiet academic life where they would teach at German universities and maybe also in American universities and sort of go across the Atlantic, have some children and live out their lives that way. But really their political beliefs drove them in a different direction. And
at the time there was a relatively large group of Germans at the end of the 20s, early 30s, who were in favor of a form of socialism or communism or all across that spectrum.
Yes.
And it was a bigger group than the Nazis.
Oh yes, much bigger.
Much bigger.
Well,
yeah.
It should be remembered. So a year before Mildred moved to Germany, in 1928, the Nazi Party got less than 3% of the vote in their Reichstag election, the German parliament. Less than 3%. And then 2 years later, it got 18%. And then 2 years later, in 1932, it got 37%. And by that point, it was, for the first time, the largest party in the Reichstag. And Mildred bore witness to this as an American, and she was appalled by the meteoric rise of the Nazi Party. And it was during this time that she decided to do something about it.
And at 37%, that was the highest vote that they got. It was then that Hitler made a deal and got the chancellorship and then moved on from there to just take over. So
he was, that was on July 31st, 1932. Yeah. And so Mildred, during this time, I should sort of back up in terms of the chronology of her involvement in the resistance. In 1932, she was lecturing at the University of Berlin, lecturing about American literature. And she was quite forthright in her views, or her political views. She lectured about William Faulkner and Jean Dos Passos and Theodore Dreiser. But her lectures moved fluidly from American novels to the prevalence of the poor in Nazi Germany and the troubling ascent of the Nazi Party. And I shouldn't say Nazi Germany yet, it wasn't yet Nazi Germany. At the time, it was a parliamentary democracy. but it
Mhm.
seemed to be moving in the direction toward fascism. And so she began to recruit her students. And just as she was very mindful of sort of ensuring that they were like-minded, and she would invite them to her apartment in Berlin. Arvid did this too, and he invited friends and colleagues and friends of friends. And they began to discuss what to do about this troubling trend. And then in 1933, in January, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, then her involvement in the resistance, both or her commitment to it, deepened. And at the same time, she and Arvid both had to be much more cautious about how they would proceed. Mildred became much more cautious about how she would recruit Germans into the resistance. The University of Berlin did fire her, ostensibly for, there was some dissatisfaction with how outspoken she was. And then in the fall of 1932, she got a job at a night school for Germans who were unemployed or basically working class Germans. And it was there where she found some of her most committed members of the group. She recruited them into this group that she nicknamed the Circle. So at this time, it was just it would come to be called something else, which I can get to with you, and I can describe how that happened. But at this time, it was a very sort of informal, scrappy group of political activists.
Well, it's the fascinating parallels that I thought that you demonstrated as that process was being undergone was that there were quite a few professional women in society in Germany. In addition to the constraints against Jews that were put into place early about your job and being in the professions, there was also a dismissal of women from their jobs simply to get the women back out. I mean, partially it's the Depression and people, like we did after World War II, that the women can go back home again and the men will take the jobs. It was one of those kind of things, but it can be part of the popularity of the Nazi Party in doing this, right? And for the men, get them their jobs and get rid of the women. And so she was part of that. It's also, I think, important to point out that these writers that she focused on were American writers that were focused on the poor and how the poor were being, abused in society, and that this was part of her socialistic idea along the
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And she wrote about this extensively in her letters to her mother back in the United States. And she wrote about the prevalence of the poor in Germany, and it deeply affected her. She felt that, and she even wrote to her mother, "We must do something about this as soon as possible." And she meant, she was speaking about the impoverished. She would see shanties lined up and people, Germans dressed in rags, begging for food, lines of unemployed people. And so she felt a great deal of compassion. This is during the Weimar era. And then she also saw a lot of bloody confrontations on the streets between communists and the police and social democrats as well. So the left and the right were very much opposed, and she writes about also as a sort of militaristic tenor that when she walked through the streets of Berlin, there was at one point where she saw a tank come up and then the gun was pointed at a crowd of unemployed workers who were basically demonstrating. And during this time, again, this was when Germany was a parliamentary democracy. So Germans still had constitutional rights. The Weimar Constitution protected freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to demonstrate in these public squares. And there was violence, a tremendous amount of violence at times, but people still got out there and were permitted to legally. There were 90 daily newspapers in Berlin alone during this time, prior to Hitler's, prior to him becoming chancellor. that represented every possible political opinion, from the extreme left to the extreme right and everything in between. So it was a very vibrant time, and also there was a tremendous amount of strife and poverty, and the gap between rich and poor was very pronounced. And so these were all of the elements of the society that she wrote about in these letters to her mother. And I should point out that my grandmother, Jane, gave me these letters. So when I was 16 years old, she gave them to me and made copies for me and said, you must write this book.
How did she know you were going to be a writer?
Because
were
I
you already writing at 16?
She knew. I had already announced at the age of 8 that I wanted to be a writer. And so, and so then when I was 16, I think my grandmother, she was waiting to tell me. I mean, it was not a story to tell an 8-year-old, and certainly she couldn't have taken me seriously at that age, but about my career ambitions. But when I was 16, she felt that it was time, and I'm just looking over here. I have the copies of the letters. I have a lot of these binders, but this is an example. And these were just, they really were portals into, I don't know if you can see, but so a lot of these are typed up. And I have notes everywhere, and it's threatened. And
on the screen, we have a couple of notes.
Yeah, but basically there were portals into her heart and mind. These letters. I mean, they're the closest I got to really understanding where she was, what she thought and felt. So
So her husband Arnoff and herself, and it's now 1933 or so, and for the next 10 years, basically, they ran a powerful underground resistance to Hitler in Berlin. And Arnoff, he went so far that he worked in the Nazi hierarchy.
Yes.
In order to disguise himself.
That's right. He lived a double life.
That's not exactly a quiet academic life that they were planning.
It is not. Again, it was not one that they envisioned. And he and it's interesting just to think about him. He was not a risk taker, and his antipathy toward the Nazi Party was and toward Hitler was pronounced. And so it was. This was something that he did very reluctantly, but he felt by 1935, just after, 2 years after Hitler became chancellor, initially they thought that Germany would reject this man, and that he was a buffoon. And a lot of people did share that view in the resistance. And the conservatives in the government thought that they could control him. And I write about this in my book, of course, and I talk about the ministers in his cabinet. He was only allowed to appoint 2 ministers, and they were really outnumbered. And they all thought that they could control him, and little did they know they soon found out that they were wrong. But the Mildred's underground group, resistance group, their first weapon against the Nazi regime was paper. They produced leaflets that denounced the regime and called for revolution. And it may seem rather mild to us to think about acts of resistance. We want to think about guns and setting off bombs and sabotaging military facilities. But at this point, it was not clear that Hitler was even planning to prepare Germany for war. It did become. By 1935, by the time Arvid got a job at the Ministry of Economics, he started, and he did this with the express purpose of gaining access to top secret documents about Hitler's operational and military strategies. This was the new strategy. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but just to back up to the leaflets, it was exceedingly dangerous. And if you got caught with one of these leaflets, you could be hauled off to a concentration camp. And indeed, that's what happened to several members of the group. So that's why in 1935, they decided we need a new strategy. We need to undermine the Nazi regime from within. Arvid got a job at the Ministry of Economics, pretended to be a loyal Nazi. I did the Heil salute. He detested it, but he went through with it so that he would gain access to these documents. And the idea was that he would then pass them off to Hitler's enemies.
Basically, though, Stalin. Basically, they gave it to Russia.
That's right. and also the
At the
United
beginning.
States. So
Yeah.
that part of the story is something that's not as well understood, and that is also the news that I bring in my book. I've interviewed Mildred's former 11-year-old courier, who they used as somebody who could help them deliver documents and other information, and set up really primarily dates when they could rendezvous outside of Berlin, away from Gestapo surveillance, and when they could exchange verbally the most confidential information. And that here, are we seeing the picture right now?
Yeah, there's a picture of Don
Yeah,
Heath up
so
there.
that's Don
I think
Heath.
it's an extraordinary thing too. This was the son of a man who worked at the embassy, the U.S.
Yes,
embassy.
the U.S. Embassy in Berlin.
And the parents said, yes, we will, son, you're going to take on this life-threatening job at 11 years of age.
That's
Really
right.
quite something.
It is quite something. That's a photograph of his father, Donald Heath Sr.
Mm-hmm.
And I tracked down Donald Heath Jr. when he was 89 years old, and he lived in Northern California, and it was a deeply moving experience interviewing him. He basically welcomed me into his home as if I were family. He remembered my grandmother, who he met when she was at that time just 22. After she had gone to live with Mildred and stayed and married a German man. And he said, and then he told me that he called Mildred Aunt Mildred and considered her a member of his family. And then he said, you're a member of my family, Rebecca. And I'll tell you everything that I remember. And it turned out that his memory was quite vivid. And he told me about the routes that he would take to Mildred's apartment. His father cautioned him to take a different route every time. So he would get off at different U-Bahn stops, and then he would take a detour sometimes to the KaDeWe, the big department store, or he would go to the top of the American church and all the way to the spire as close as he could get and survey the landscape, and then go down. His father told him to look in the reflections of the store windows to make sure nobody was following him. And then when he arrived, Mildred would also ask him, where did you go? What route did you take? Did you talk to anybody? And this was between 1939 and 1941. He went to her apartment about twice a week, ostensibly for tutoring sessions. And then at the end of these sessions, then she would slip into his knapsack a piece of paper. And again, as I alluded to earlier, most often it was a date and a time where they could rendezvous outside of Berlin and exchange information verbally.
That's Mildred meeting her father, right?
Sorry?
Those appointments were for her to meet Don's father.
Right. So it was actually two couples. It was Mildred and Arvid Harnack, and then it was Don and Louise Heath. And so they would meet at the Spreewald, for example, and go for hikes and have a picnic. And anybody who was passing by would think, oh, two couples having a picnic, isn't that lovely? And while they were indeed friends and became quite close, there was another purpose. And Don would actually, he was really at the center of his own John le Carré novel. He would run around. He dressed in he was in a boy gang with other German boys. He was the only American, and his friend Mole stole a Hitler Youth uniform for him, so he would wear it. Though his parents, much to their disapproval, but he said, I have to have this disguise. And he would run around and make sure that there were no authorities who were basically eavesdropping on the conversation that his parents were having with Mildred and Arvid. And if he did see somebody, he would whistle a tune.
So he would walk around the perimeter of where they were meeting and keep an eye out.
Yes.
As an 11, 12, 13-year-old boy.
That's correct. And there was one occasion when Mildred actually asked Louise, his mother, whether he could come to a location in Berlin and help basically perform the same duty, basically make sure that she wasn't being followed. And she exchanged a satchel with a woman who was from Leipzig. That's all that Don remembered. He said that she was the lady from Leipzig, but he did the same thing. He followed them and sort of ran around and pretending to eye squirrels and in the trees, and then when he saw that they were not being followed, he would whistle. I was deeply interested, and the details that he provided about what it was like to live in Berlin, the cook that they had, who was a Gestapo spy, and he mentioned that his mother caught this cook, who he called Mamselle, because he couldn't pronounce the word mam was mademoiselle, and she spoke French, but she was there as an employee, but basically was employed, would cook their dinners and lunches, and once his mother caught her going through her diary. Louise caught Mamselle going through her diary, and I asked Don, where is that diary? And he said, oh, it's gone. I asked him this several times over the course of my interviews. And then after my final interview, Don said, well, now I can die. And it was very theatrical and moving. And I said, don't do that. And then a month later, he did pass away. And then his family invited me to come out again and go through 12 steamer trunks of documents. And I jumped on a plane again and flew out there. And it was at this time that I discovered Louise Heath's diary. And so that's actually not the diary, but that's something else that I can explain what that is in a moment.
Yeah.
But I do show photographs of the diary in the book, and I was able to corroborate so much of what Don said. And so that was it was really a treasure trove for me. Was a big moment in my research.
Yeah, it must have been because you'd already done a lot of research.
Yes,
to get the corroboration.
I wanted to connect those dots.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So before we go further into the story, I'd like to back up just a little bit back to the early 30s again, and talk about, because I think it's extremely relevant to things that are going on now in several countries in the world, and has always happened as humanity kind of plays with democracy and then kind of leans back towards authoritarianism and then moves in the other direction. I think things are going on in China right now that are also like this. And of course, we had our own flirtation with authoritarianism not too long ago here. And I thought it was fascinating that you discussed what Goebbels said in 32 or 33 of how to move society back towards authoritarianism. And one of the things they said, this comes right out of the news from China today, is the feminization of men.
Yes.
You quoted Goebbels as saying, why don't you have that quote, or
I do actually. Hang on. I actually opened up to the page here when you first brought up women in Nazi Germany.
Okay, great.
And how they rapidly lost their rights.
And this was early in the time of the Nazis.
This is very early. I have a chapter. All of my chapters, it proceeds chronologically. So this is 1933 to 1934. I can just read.
Just read it. Yeah, that's great because people will be.
The role of women is to populate Germany with good Germans. This is what Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda Joseph Goebbels announces in a speech he delivers in a crowded hall in Berlin. He has given his speech a humdrum title, German Women, but he delivers it with verve. Women during the Weimar Republic, during the Weimar era, were granted too many rights, Goebbels tells the crowd. Women shouldn't hold public office or compete with men in the workplace. And then he says, and I quote, "The feminization of men always leads to the masculinization of women. And the net result is profound despair for both sexes." And then he goes on to say, "A fundamental change is necessary."
Yeah.
And the first, best, and most suitable, I'm still quoting, and most suitable place for the woman is in the family, and her most glorious duty is to give children to the people and nation, children who can continue the line generations and who guarantee the immortality of the nation. And Hitler goes on in another speech to echo this sentiment. He says, "We do not think it proper for women to invade the world of man, to enter his territory. Instead, we think it natural for these two worlds to remain separate. And that is why women have always been man's helper, and as such, his most loyal friend, and why man has always been his wife's protector, and as such, her best friend." And after he delivered this speech, there was a tremendous applause. The people who were applauding were women in the Nazi Women's League. And so, these sentiments were very much by a segment of the population, a very large segment, embraced.
And when it was popular, he also said, you quoted him as saying, the emancipation of women is a mistake of the Jewish intellect, or it's
yes,
like
that's right.
the Jewish idea. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yes.
So he blamed that on the Jews as well. Yeah.
Yes, he did.
It's also, I mean, there's also a small irony to the story, which is that, to enforce these new ideas, I think it was Goebbels' wife that was put in charge, but she didn't quite live up to the job.
Yes.
Yeah. And who was she replaced by? That's even funnier. Why don't you tell that part of the story? That's just.
Oh, okay. Well, so Hitler establishes an organization called the German Fashion Institute, and he installs Magda Goebbels to serve as the honorary president. And she was blonde, she was blue-eyed, and she seemed perfect for the job, a model of Aryan beauty and fertility. She had just given birth to a daughter. Between 1934 and 1940, she would have 5 more children, all beginning with their names beginning with the letter H. So Hitler may have been honored by her fidelity to the letter H, but he was disappointed by her performance as honorary president, because she would show up with a cigarette in a long, in a gold-tipped handle. German women were not supposed to smoke. They were not supposed to wear makeup. They were supposed to wear dirndls. They were supposed to have suntanned faces, and they were never supposed to wear anything resembling heels. What was basically fetishized was this idea of German peasants, and she was the antithesis of that. And she wore Parisian fashion, and so she told a journalist that the German woman of the future should be stylish, beautiful, and intelligent. And she was booted basically after that.
Not the same goal, right?
Not the same goal at all. And then that institute changed its name over the course of the next couple of years, but then installed in a leadership position instead of Magda Goebbels was Joseph Goebbels' mistress, Hella Struhl, who happened to live in the same apartment building as Don Heath, little Don Heath, and his parents, Donald and Louise Heath. And when among the documents and photographs that I found, I found evidence of that as well, and also a photograph that she had taken of Don and his mother. So.
All right. Well, that was a little aside back to the history, but definitely, when any country moves and liberalizes their rules for all the different ways that people want to live their lives, it's not hard to shove it back to the sort of majority view. This is the way it should be, and we're going to do it that way.
I think it should be, noted some, and I'm just going to touch on this and just tell the viewers that I have a tremendous, but I did extensive research on this subject and many others, but I was very interested in how women were quickly demoted in society at a time during the Weimar era. The Constitution gave women the right to vote, and women could hold public office. But very quickly after Hitler became chancellor, 119,000 women in leadership positions at the ministries and in regional and local governments lost their jobs.
Mhm.
And women across Germany lost their jobs as doctors, as lawyers. Waitresses were owners of restaurants were urged to fire their waitresses and replace them with waiters. And this happened in many segments of society, and so this was in universities. There was a quota placed on the number of women who were allowed to be students at universities, and so fewer than 10% of the population of the students could be female. And prior to Hitler becoming chancellor, there were over 18,000 female university students in Germany.
Mhm.
After Hitler took power, the number plummeted to 5,447.
Mhm. Yeah, it's important to remember. Very important to remember, and it's not just a Nazi thing. It's an authoritarian thing to get a large number of people in the majority view to get excited about being more restrictive to other people.
Right.
And so they pick on some group that they can pick on.
Right. And authoritarianism, absolutely. And I also, and so as I follow how women's rights were taken away and sort of demoted in society, of course, I follow how Jews were systematically persecuted, and I really tell the story of the Holocaust and how it developed. So I follow all of these narrative lines and show the reader. You notice when I read, perhaps, that I write in the present tense. I want readers to experience the rapid rise of fascism as if they were there, as if it's happening right now, because I think that really drives it home. When we read history books and everything is in the past tense, it's one way in which history, we create this kind of distance between today and what happened before. And I wanted to collapse that difference and that distance and show, yes, there are differences, certainly, but it's also important to understand that there are parallels as well. And I think that we all need a history lesson right now, and we need to understand how fragile democracy is and can be.
Yeah. And how, if you just stick to a couple principles, it can be very robust. The democracy can be very robust. But those principles, when you violate the principles, you get on a slippery slope, and you've got to watch out. And
people tend to think that if they don't know the history, when I speak to people, they think. And I've had a lot of readers write to me, and they said, "Well, I thought that there was a bloody coup, when Hitler took power. Right. I thought that guns were fired, and they had no idea this was done legally, entirely legally, with the assent of the people in government who held office."
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, we'll leave a lot of those details, because you did a great job of putting somebody right in that position of watching it unfold through Mildred's eyes and even through Don's eyes and so on and so forth. So, I mean, those details are valuable. And so anybody who likes to read books, it's a great book to read about all that too, besides Mildred's story. But we have a little bit of time, and I want to talk about the tragic end and the group of people that they got together. So now they've been spies, and they've been passing information first to the Soviets, who they were in favor of, and then they were really obviously disappointed when Stalin made his pact with Hitler. But they also were giving information to the Americans and then to the British. And so they developed this great underground resistance, and they thought they'd have to escape, and every once in a while, so they had an escape plan. It was all very, very dangerous. But you have a picture of a lot of them got caught.
That's right. So those are the Gestapo mugshots of some of the members of the group. The Gestapo arrested 119 of them, and so there you see some of the members, including Mildred and Arvid Harnack.
Yeah, and the book coming, or you can take a look at that snapshot and open it up a little bit, because it's a very interesting how the people now they're all in prison together, or it's not, some of them are in one place, some are in another place. The women are separated from the men and everything. you said how they communicated with each other. It was very interesting because they were all
yes.
supposed to be separate. Yeah.
Right. Well, they were all arrested and thrown into the basement prison of Gestapo headquarters. Actually, Mildred and Arvid were on the way to Sweden. That was their plan. And they were caught in Nazi-occupied Lithuania.
They knew that there had been a leak, right?
They knew there was a leak.
Right.
One of the key members of the group, Harald Schulze-Boysen, was arrested, and his wife, Libertas, basically spread the word to as many people as possible in the group. Basically that the Gestapo were onto us. So Mildred and Arvid tried to flee. They were arrested by an SS officer named Horst Kopko and hauled back to Gestapo headquarters, as were others in the group over the course of the next few months. And so the basement prison and Gestapo headquarters soon filled to capacity. And so the women were sent to women's prisons in Berlin, and the men to men's prisons. Mildred was then taken back to Gestapo headquarters daily and interrogated and tortured, as were others in the group. And then there was a preparation for a mass treason trial. And basically, there were this mass treason trial. It was really, there was no, it had the appearance of due process, but of course, nothing, there was no justice served at all. And
it was a little ironic because they kind of took that show trial from Stalin.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Who this group had supported all the way until Stalin turned on him. So they, terrible irony.
It's a terrible irony. I wholeheartedly agree. And during this time, they were not allowed. Members of this group were not allowed to communicate with one another. It was strictly prohibited. And so they developed methods of communicating. And there were two primary ways that I uncovered in my research. One was a kind of knock language, and Gunther Weissenborn writes about this. He's a survivor, actually. He managed to survive, and wrote about this in his memoir. And so, and he basically developed an alphabet of knocks, and soon others learned this knock language, and they were able to warn each other about police, about guards, about the interrogators, about. There were basically the authorities were trying to, and again, sort of the appearance of justice. They needed two pieces of evidence to condemn somebody to death. As a traitor. And so it was very easy under torture to get evidence that people would just blurt out other people's names. And so the knock language was a way of informing people in the group, oh, so-and-so said this about the other person, and make sure that you don't say this, or make sure you contradict that to save that person. And so that was one method. And late at night, you could hear a symphony of knocks in these men's prisons. Another method that women used was these notes, which have a German word called Kassiber, and they're basically secret notes passed in prison. They would again convey information, gossip, news, and.
Arnav, can you show a copy?
Right. We do have a slide of that.
We have a copy of that one. Yeah, I think it's the next slide. Yeah.
Not
the
that.
one before that.
Intelligence document. Keep going. There we go.
Yeah.
So I feature this in my book. This is a Kassiber. This is an example of one. It's a large one. Sometimes there are little bits of paper, and sometimes they're on a full piece of paper. And this is one actually where somebody's the person who's writing this wrote about Mildred and wrote about one of the members of the group who betrayed her to Gestapo interrogators. And so, and they would pass these notes in the prison yard. They were allowed to take one very brief walk once a day out in the prison yard, sort of around the periphery. And they would secretly pass them. They would also hide them in the cracks and fissures of the prison walls. And the reason we have some of them today is that they would sew them into the seams of their garments. One way that the prisons saved money during the Nazi regime was to require the families of the prisoners to pick up the dirty laundry and to do their laundry and then bring it back, which became an excellent way to pass notes.
I was going to say, what a dumb way to save money.
So exactly. This is why we have these notes. So I found these in a Berlin archive at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand.
All right. Well, so they're in prison and they're brought up for trial.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Mildred, who is understood to be one of the ringleaders, I think, right, by the Nazis.
Yes. Although she tried to save herself and present herself as somebody who didn't know anything.
Didn't know anything. She was able to keep to not saying anything for a long period of time, or she never said anything, right? So
you mean in the courtroom?
She never confessed or gave out. I mean, that was the impression I got from
Oh,
her.
right. No, under interrogation, she did not.
Never cracked. Yeah.
Right. No, she did not. And then, and then during the first trial in December, she basically capitalized on the sort of internalized sexism of the men who were in the room,
right.
and just said she was just a wife. She didn't know anything.
Right.
So I should also mention that the courtroom was it was a military court. It was the Reich Court Martial. It's called the Reichskriegsgericht. And usually the defendants who were there were military officers. But everybody else was a civilian, and so this was unusual. And during that first trial, she saw Arvid for the first time. She hadn't seen him for 3.5 months. During that time, she was in solitary confinement, and Arvid was declared a traitor, and he received a death sentence to be hanged. Harro Schulze-Boysen also received the same sentence and punishment, and others in the group as well. But Mildred was given a sentence of 6 years in prison in a kind of a work camp. 2 days later, Hitler found out about this and ordered a reversal. And so on February 16th, 1943, she was strapped down to a guillotine at Plötzensee prison and beheaded.
Yeah. And we have an article that came out about it there from the New York Times, right? And
the New York Times, that was December 1st, 1947. And there are little red arrows pointing at all of the errors. There are so many inaccuracies and errors over the decades since her execution that gets sort of passed down from one decade to another.
It's interesting in journalism. I mean, if you ever do something and then it's written about, you can always see the errors and you wonder how many stories are you. Sometimes they get it actually close to being right, at least in the big picture, but then a lot of details wrong. But it's not unusual for there to be 6 or 7 mistakes in an article like this. The image is grabbed and sent out. So the image at the time was, and it was, when did this show up? Was it right at the time,
December
right?
1, 1947. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And it says Hitler beheads American woman, something like that. I can't read the headline. It's too small. Yeah. Hitler beheads American woman as a personal reprisal. Yeah.
But how did the information leak out to the family? Did it get to the family right away?
It's a long, I describe in detail the attempt of Harriet, her eldest sister. By that time, their mother had died. And so Harriet took it upon herself to try to track her down. She wrote to the Red Cross, and she was very frustrated. They hadn't heard. For all of a sudden, the letters stopped. And so she is this something to do with the war? Has something happened? And then she discovered. I don't know if I should give this away. Actually,
no, you don't. You don't have to give it away. We can have some secrets for the book.
Read the book and find out more. It was a very unusual way of finding out that what had happened to her sister, and really I think illustrates just how information was so precious and how precious little there was of it. I know that we're running out of time and we might want to take questions, but I also want to point out what the title of my book. People often ask why All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. And it's a line from a Goethe poem that she was translating right before she was, executed. And there is a slide.
There's a slide on that one. Yeah.
You can find that I include a photograph of the book. There we go. So that's one page, and so you see her handwritten English translations in the margins of that book of Goethe poetry. So she was bent over this book of poems when the prison chaplain Harald Pulschau came in right before she was executed, and he was there to give her comfort. He was also there as a secret member of the resistance, and he wrote a memoir after the war, but he often passed notes between families and the condemned. And one thing that he did was smuggle this book out under the folds of his robes. And so this is why we have the book today, and it's in a German archive.
As you said, there wasn't much leaking of information, but it's still impressive how much information did leak and how many holes there were in a system that attempts to be absolute, in stopping people.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah. And then one of the lessons from this is if you're ever put in that position, lie to the authorities based on their own preconceived concepts about what their prejudices are about you. You'll probably have your best bet of getting as much out of the situation as you possibly can, even though it's, that's not saying much.
Yes, it can be a good strategy.
Yeah. Let's go through the last few pictures, and then we'll do some questions from the audience. So let's just go through. So in this piece of information,
this is an example of one of the intelligence documents that I uncovered in my research, and it just sort of does illustrate some of the ingrained sexism, even in the authorities who were looking at this case in the United States. And you see there's a list of all of the people in the group, the men and the women, and in one column, and in the other column, is listed their professions. And you'll see the red arrows point to the women's professions. And in every case, it's wife of. That was their profession. Yeah. And even Mildred was a professor. She had her PhD. She lectured at the University of Berlin. But according to this U.S. intelligence document, she was just a wife. And so that's telling in terms of the historiography of this group.
And that was the U.S. intelligence.
That was the U.S., yeah.
And we're not talking about the Nazis here. This is what the U.S. said. There's other people are aware of this too. You're not the only one that's written about this, of course. But the use of some of the Nazis by the U.S. intelligence services after the war, they allowed them to go to work for them instead of being, put on trial.
Yes, that's true. U.S. and British intelligence recruited Nazis who were involved in the arrest, torture, and execution of Mildred Harnack, as well as others.
That's another.
And they never faced trial at Nuremberg.
No. They had too much valuable information for something else.
Well, yeah.
It was particularly against the Soviets, right?
That's exactly right. They basically, these Nazis sort of duped U.S. and British intelligence into thinking that they had access to knowledge of a vast Soviet espionage network that was threatening their democracies, and this was just a fiction. But
they use the same strategy that I was suggesting to other people. When somebody's in charge of you, you lie to them about their preconceived notions.
That's right. That's correct. It worked for them.
It worked for them. That's right. Yeah. They got free for the rest of their lives. So let's look at the next one. Yeah. Okay. This is a picture of Mildred.
Just an East German stamp. Yeah. More stuff about sexism. You see, Arvid Harnack is Dr. Arvid Harnack, and Mildred is Mildred Harnack, even though both of them had PhDs.
Yeah.
And we recently had a controversy of that, of course, in our current cultural environment. So it's an example of a sort of parallel. And these slides, this is David Dolan, who is a historian, and in his book Soviet Espionage, this is how he described Mildred: essentially a non-political person interested only in literature and languages.
Yeah.
So these were the people who used to write about Mildred. And there's another one, Heinz Hohne, who was an editor at Der Spiegel, a very respected journalist. And in his book about this group, he said, published in the 70s, he said, as a wife, Mildred followed her husband's line. She was basically non-political.
Well, we have a good question in from the audience that's right up this line.
Yeah.
They wanted to know, did this circle of the resistance, was it connected to any other groups, and did they have any influence or know the people who tried to kill Hitler, which was
I love this question.
Yeah.
Yes. So the group that Mildred nicknamed the Circle in the early 30s intersected with at least 3 other underground resistance networks. It was a sort of small, scrappy groups, underground groups that formed a kind of interlocking chain. Mildred's husband, Arvid Harnack, was related to a number. A number of his cousins were involved in the Valkyrie plot, the 1944 July plot to assassinate Hitler, including Hans von Dohnanyi, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Klaus Bonhoeffer, and Ernst von Harnack.
A relative.
Anyway, pardon me?
The Harnack was a relative. I mean,
yes. And these others I named were cousins. So there was a bunch of families who grew up. The Harnacks lived next to a number of other families in a suburb of Berlin called Grunewald, and they intermarried, and they were all staunchly anti-Nazi and very committed to the resistance. And so yes, there also his brother Falk Harnack was a member of the Weiße Rose, the White Rose, if anyone has heard of that. And so there was communication between these groups, definitely, and there were connections that united them.
It's amazing that that there was no leak for so many years because of the interconnections from one group to the next. You'd think somebody.
Yeah, it is surprising.
Yeah, they must not have placed any agents in there for quite a while.
Yes.
We wanted to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The next question goes right to that because it's what was the leak? How did it unravel? How did they get caught?
To give a very simple,
do a very short version. So
very short version because it has actually a very complicated answer, which took a lot of pages to chronicle. But essentially, during the war, when the group was passing information to the Soviets, to Moscow Center, they used radio transmitters, and one of these messages was intercepted by the Funkabwehr, the radio signals part of the Abwehr, which is German intelligence, and they intercepted several of these messages, and there was basically the person who had written the message had committed a fatal espionage 101 error and had listed the real names and addresses of members of the group, not code names. And so the Funkabwehr basically put their finest cryptologists on the job, and it took them a year, but they cracked the code, and then the Gestapo pounced and arrested as many as they could.
So it was encoded information, but they didn't use the coded names. They used the real names.
They used the real names.
And so it took them a year to figure it out. But once they had cracked the code, they knew exactly whose houses to go to.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And also maybe tell Libertas's story. That's for me. I mean, that was just tough. That she was the one that warned them off when they first came in, but she was also the one that couldn't stand up to the torture, right?
That's right. She wasn't, there's no available evidence that she was tortured. She was assigned a different interrogator, not the interrogator who was basically known for being a sadistic and the one who tortured both Mildred and Arvid. But Libertas was also quite two-faced, and she basically told the Gestapo in an effort to save herself. When she was interrogated, she whispered the names of numerous members of their group who the Gestapo had no idea about at all, including Hans and Hilda Koppi, whose son, Hilda was quite pregnant, and she gave birth in prison. And her son, Hans Koppi Jr., basically is committed his life to studying the resistance, and I got in contact with him, and he is the director of the Red Orchestra collection at the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, the German Resistance Memorial Center, and so he provided me with a lot of these documents.
And he literally was born just before his mother was executed.
He was born right before, yes, as she was allowed to breastfeed him, and then they decapitated her.
Right. And then he was given to, who was he given to an adoption service? How did he find out who his parents were? Do you know? I don't know.
Well, one of the surviving members, Greta Kukov, was his godmother. But with family members, he was turned over to family members. But
Okay.
Greta Kukov stayed in touch with him, and Hans Koppe and I, he actually took me on a tour around Berlin, and we drove to all the different places where Mildred lived, and he was a tremendous resource for me.
So how long did you spend doing this research? Because it sounds like this was a big project, very big project.
Oh, yes, it was a tremendous project. I think, I've done research over the years. I mean, certainly when I held the letters that my grandmother gave me when I was 16, that was the first time I was acquainted with any kind of research materials. She also was the person who told me about Don Heath and said there was an 11-year-old boy who was Mildred's courier. So the name just stuck in my head. And then over the year, I decided that I would keep my promise and I would write this book one day. I did decide that I would write a few more books before I wrote this one, because it is, I knew that it was, that it would require tremendous research, and I wanted to do justice to the story. So after my second book was published, I went to Berlin and went to the Gedenkstätte Deutsche Widerstand, this archive. And I met with the director there and asked if I could gain access to the documents. And he said yes. And so that sort of, I began then, but actually then I did set it aside before I got too involved and wrote another book. And then in the run up to the presidential election, 2016, I thought, I put that book aside, and I thought I actually need to write this book now. And I started researching this book in earnest, and I went to archives, other archives as well. And in Berlin, I went to the National Archive in London to look at their espionage files. I went to the Library of Congress here in the U.S. and the National Archives, and I went to Wisconsin and across the United States in various places to gather as much information as possible. And I also worked with a Moscow-based historian who had access to archives and intelligence documents as well. Most of those documents are under lock and key, I should say. Yeah. And I was aware that, there are, of course, holes in a story when a lot of the documents were destroyed by the Nazis. I mean, the trial transcripts from the Reichskriegsgericht mass trial, they were destroyed by Nazi authorities. There are two stories about what happened. One story goes that somebody made a big pyre and torched them all. And another story is that they buried them in Lüneburg, and they're somewhere there buried. Who knows? But we do have the sentencing documents, so we do know. This is why we know that Mildred was able to convince this panel of judges that she was just a wife and she didn't know what was going on in the first trial anyway.
Well, Rebecca, you did more than justice to the story. You did a great job of bringing that to life. I mean, it was really moving, and it moved very, very quickly. And it was a nice, very, very unique viewpoint on something that we hope doesn't repeat itself in history, but unfortunately does. First, thanks for bringing it out. I'm glad your family is all happy that you brought it out as well. Because every once in a while, one doesn't like to drag out the relative that people don't want to talk about. But your family should be very proud.
Yeah, they're
very proud.
Yeah, legacy too, and So, well, thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much. And so ends another event of the Commonwealth Club in its 119th year of enlightened discussion. Thanks again, Rebecca. It was great.
Thank you, George.